Can you all hear me all right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
All right. I want to thank Matt and Jahan and the Center for Poetry and Poetics, Creative Writing in the English Department, and the Institute of the Humanities and Global Cultures for bringing us here today. Thank you, Adrian, for the welcome. This talk is called Poems for Near Futures. So in an age of intensifying planetary crisis, what kind of future is imaginable? How can we imagine through catastrophe? In his recent book, The Nutmeg's Curse, novelist and critic Amitav Ghosh argues that dominant cultural and political visions for the future are based in vantages of destruction. Whether through climate modeling by scientific experts that speculates on the extent of coming damage to the Earth system, military and economic assessments of how to mitigate climate disaster, or the dystopian spectacles and terraforming visions of sci-fi, the future seems largely defined by various forms of the negative, disastrous, bleak, unimaginable. Ghosh argues that these destructive imaginaries are a necessary outcome of ongoing legacies of colonial domination, extraction, and extermination. Legacies which reduce the world's living beings and ecological systems to profitable resource or extraneous remainder. These future visions of impending disaster, in turn, render climate change as seemingly inevitable and unstoppable in our present. This present appears, in turn, as what critic Harry Haroutunian terms the endless everyday, an ahistorical and hyper-immediate surround, another form of capitalist realism expanded into continually renaturalized new normals of infrastructure collapse and record heat waves. Climate change denial and disregard, abetted by the active disinformation campaigns of corporate interests, structure our everyday perceptions, so that climate realities become at once difficult to perceive and normalized, a kind of collective time denial, to borrow geologist Martha Bernerude's phrase. Critic Anna Kornblue calls this a pervasive ethos of immediacy, urgency, extremity, no future, only presence, she writes. For all of these thinkers, climate crisis is at once a material calamity and an emergency of cultural response. As Ghosh has famously argued, the climate crisis is a failure of imagination. And they each argue in turn for the importance of cultivating aesthetic practices that highlight creative future thinking, or what Bjernerude calls practices of timefulness, to counter these dominant logics. So while storytelling, narrative arts, and the novel form tend to occupy a central place in such arguments, today I develop a brief for contemporary Anglophone poetry and what I call its speculative turn, as a sustained aesthetic response to these imaginative challenges. This speculative turn eschews visions of apocalyptic future or planetary exhaustion in favor of more equivocal, provisional portrayals of near futures. In her recent book of experimental poems, Your Kingdom, Eleni Stiklianos writes, "Our cells recall chemical joys and traumas, pre-life, while our limbs remember salamanders. A poem remembers our past in language and posits a future in the simplest sense, like a to-do note, hoping that it will be seen at some point hence and remind us of something worth knowing, feeling." Stiklianos invokes poetry as a memory form, a primary means of drawing attention to deep continuities that connect ecological pasts and presents, human and non-human beings. And she describes poetry as bearing the capacity to imagine simplified visions for or instructions toward a future, a to-do note for readers to come. So here I consider a series of contemporary works that offer such to-do notes. These poems and poets ask, how might we live in a near climate future by considering how destruction, transformation, and renewal already shape the ongoing experiences of varied life worlds and their inhabitants. They explore how the world to come is made from what exists now, elaborating connections between past, presents, and futures in order to make the future imaginable. These poems do not narrate totalized visions of the future, whether dystopian or utopian, or depict forms of scenario planning or terraforming schemes in the wake of generalized crisis. These works operate at a different scale, the scale of poetic form and figuration, of attention to the properties of language and the affordances of time. They offer speculative methods for contemplating what we can't see or understand directly, rescaling elements of lyric address and registering temporal contradiction and complexity. These works enact what SF writer Samuel Delany calls subjunctivity, the play between verisimilitude and creative projection, what has not yet happened but might, what might be happening, what is happening but might still be different. That is, the varied and multiple forms of the what if that might creatively outmaneuver the negative, the no time, the futurelessness of our contemporary cultural imaginaries. First, I'll talk about speculative address. With whom am I speaking? Are you one or many? What are you? Do I make myself clear? Is this what we call speech, what you use? Are you a living form, such as the form I inhabit now, letting it speak me? These lines are from Joy Graham's poem, 22040, from her new book of the same title, which we'll probably hear some from today. 22040 does not narratively describe or world build the future of 2040. Don't see 2040 in this book. Graham's poem is instead built on the essential properties of lyric address, an intimate, direct voicing to an other. So as Jonathan Culler writes, lyric address necessarily involves what he calls an impossible imperative, to bring the other into full flesh and blood presence, to allow the other to speak back. Graham's poem addresses the near future of our present and attempts to give it life, presence, and form. 22040 is also for this future. The poem imagines a possible language through which we can address what is to come, an animating language that imaginatively calls this future into being, figuring something where nothing yet exists. It is an apostrophic inquiry scaled up to the planetary whole and scaled down to the not yet. Such calling forth is the intrinsic condition of lyric address itself, as an investigation of poetic language's capacity for acts of animation, not only in time, but over time. As Barbara Johnson asserts in Apostrophe, Animation, and Abortion, quote, what the poem ends up wanting to know is whether its own rhetorical strategies can be effective. The final question becomes, can this gap be bridged? Can this loss be healed through language alone? Graham's poem poses this question through questions rather than assertive figuration, reflecting a profound uncertainty that creative language will continue to sustain collective meaning or enact forms of repair. Yet if the poem centers on this abiding uncertainty, it also enacts the urgent need to envision, acknowledge, and address a near horizon, to render this future apprehensible in and through the mediation of address, to think ahead and to remember. The poem ends by posing a final question, one that echoes and amplifies Johnson's claim about Apostrophe's inquiry into its own power. What was it? You must remember. What was your message? What were you meant to pass on? Graham poses this question without answer, leaving the message, a message to and from and for those ahead, unread, unknown. And yet the poem's message about circuits of exchange and communication, about the language of poetry as a site for holding and bearing and passing on, that message remains passed on to readers in the present. Another recent work of poetry that similarly develops modes of speculative address to near futures is Brenda Shaughnessy's wonderful and strange book, The Octopus Museum. Shaughnessy's book invents a near future where life on Earth is governed by intelligent cephalopods who've come ashore after their oceanic habitat was ruined. The book's recursive, multivalent address threads between human and non-human, present and future, across forms of embodiment and intelligence, to consider the capacities and limits of various dimensions of life on a future planet at once familiar and jarringly different. The lyric voice of this book speaks in disorienting and disoriented terms, sometimes as an address from the future, describing lives altered and planetary conditions remade, sometimes as a woman in our present, speculating on forms of calamity on the imminent horizon, and sometimes as a non-human voice, the cephalopods speaking to us. One poem, New Time Change, envisions these sentient beings ventriloquizing cliched phrases to communicate with humans about their collective fate. You had your time, you took your time after time, you had your cake by the ocean and ate it too, but now the tide is turned, the times tables too. When it's time to change, you've got to rearrange, hashtag time's up. And for old time's sake, we will remember you in our future. That time is now. How soon is now? The moon is how we know. If, as Susan Stewart writes, poetic making is an anthropomorphic project, creating figurations that bring recognizable beings into presence, Shaughnessy's address involves a more estranging anthropomorphism. Here, the future human addressee becomes a figure not of species mastery, but of defamiliarized abjection, and the communicative exchange is itself rendered opaque, filtered through jingles and recycled phrases. What if the world's creatures were the ones who could animate or depersonify us? How might we already, in fact, depend on intelligent beings who read us, who use our communicative forms to address us? How might we reorient our understanding of anthropogenic power and agency to accommodate these non-human forces and their capacities for speech? By raising these questions, Shaughnessy's poetic project undertakes a sustained speculative thought experiment in what Julietta Singh calls unthinking mastery. I want to point quickly to one more speculative climate address, Craig Santos Perez's series of love poems in the time of climate change. Perez asks, what is a love poem in a time of climate transformation? These remarkable sonnets, I'm not going to read them, but you can read this as I speak. These remarkable sonnets recast Pablo Neruda's love sonnets to address a beloved that seems to be at once the planet itself, communities who have been dispossessed, marginalized, and subjected to climate violence, and a particular beloved you. Love language and the address to beloved emerges here as a speculative assertion of a commitment to life to come, as we see in this image of the seed bank in this poem, and an insistence on the ongoing urgent kinship between human and non-human life. Perez's love poems underscore the profound unevenness and violence of climate effects in a warming world, and create in response a voicing of vulnerability, dependency, and what Indigenous scholar Gerald Visner calls a love language of survivance. 2, lyric times and timefulness. If poems such as Graham's and Shaughnessy's and Perez's enact speculative future thinking by reorienting lyric address, others explore the properties and motions of time itself as contradictory and multivalent. So here we might return to Sharon Cameron's essential formulations in Lyric Time, that poetry's workings involve a temporal structure, that the relationship between the parts of the poem is a temporal relationship. Lyric poetry for Cameron is distinctive in its attempt to escape time, decisively turning away from the temporal present and the broader workings of history toward interior time. The power and promise of the lyric poem, Cameron argues, is in the way that temporal structures seem to defy or unmake time as order, sequence, continuity, and progression. If, in Cameron's argument, the lyric becomes a way of marking the profound contradiction between personal and social time, an array of contemporary speculative poetics instead investigate contradictions and nonlinearity as immanent to the Earth systems and its life worlds, widening lyric time as the deictic now to encompass multiple and complex horizons. These works cultivate what Bjornrud calls a polytemporal vantage, attuned both to crisis and continuity, slowness, and speed. So today I'll just give 3 brief examples. First, Inupiat poet DJ D.G. Nanukaupik's 2012 book, Corpse Whale, develops poems that convey the ecological lifeways and energetic relations of ancestral land in Alaska. Her book unfolds through a series of seasonally marked poems that convey a sense of the ongoingness and survivance of Inupiat community amidst the lifeways in which they're embedded. Corpse Whale's poems draw together past and present, singular and communal, human and non-human, as a unified and continuous experience, which she calls our time. At the same time, the text reminds readers of the fragility of this metabolic web, its susceptibility to rupture and depletion through the ongoing violence of colonial capitalist extractivism. So one poem called Days of Next Yesterday, which I have up here, chronicles the new forms of species scarcity and climate alteration that come to characterize her home's changing landscape as its intrinsic rhythms are reshaped to the tempos of fossil capital and the associated effects of climate change. Watch the ice shrink. No polar bear in days. No blue snow, only white rain. In this book, no time and our time exist in powerful and abiding contradiction. Second, Anneliese Gelman's recent book, Vexations, creates a repeating pattern of sestets with recurring phrases and lines that create an ambient mood of disquiet and anxiety. This book is modeled on Eric Satie's similarly disquieting 18-hour experimental piano piece of repeating triads, a durational work of conceptual repetition that Vexations remakes in these poetic sestets. Across its pages, Vexations unfolds a speculative account of ecological and social breakdown and the undefined illness of a daughter as narrated by her mother. Interspersed with these urgent accounts of socio-ecological and physical devastation are lines describing moments of mundane daily life, ecological rhythms, new cultural phenomena, moments of beauty and terror. Cyclical time, everyday time, emergency time weave together through the durational extension and repetitions of the book. Its nonlinear progress dwells in a subjunctivity, attuned to each ecological crisis, but also persisting through and around it. In Gelman's book, things seem to happen, and then they seem not to have happened. Time moves in one direction, and then it folds over, turns anew, reverses. Through the recursive motions of these blocks of verse, patterns change, emergency turns into emergence, and then sideways again. Poetic thought and formal action in such poems lets this maybe, this what if, happen. And finally, I want to highlight my fellow panelist, Brian Tier's powerful Doomstead Days, composed of a series of long poems that coordinate the somatic time of one person walking, breathing, thinking, with the multiple and various temporalities of broader life forms and earthly cycles, watersheds, oceans, soil, animal life, through a series of intricate poetic forms such as renga and haiku that involve patterned interconnection but also paratactic leap. Tier listens, attends, observes, imagines with these varied earth beings and phenomena, exploring how their tempos are being altered and remade in our doomstead days, but also staying with their aliveness, their stubborn vitality. Cultivating ongoing practices of attention to time beyond the immediacy of one lyric moment, Tier's book both contemplates and resists forms of time denial and apocalyptic thinking to create a work rich with timefulness for our present. The works I've discussed today share a complex dialectic of determination and openness, framing poetry as a living record of adjustment, adaptation, revival, cooperation, and loss. These works imagine variable prospects for the future rather than a single linear trajectory, giving voice and figuration to what Amitav Ghosh calls the hidden forces already shaping our earthly lives. These works demand that we not cede the imaginative work of speculation to those who would define our collective socio-ecological resources solely by way of profit or plunder, accumulation and extinction. They both acknowledge and work against what critic Susan Stewart calls the end of imagining, insisting on the need to creatively think with the complexities of planetary times and futures. The essential properties of poetry, voice and address, figuration and animation, repetition and variation, conditional structures and non-closure are, I have been arguing, necessary imaginative methods for such timeful thinking in our present. In a calamitous era, poetry's speculations might help us to remember what poet Brenda Hillman asserts in her recent book, In a Few Minutes Before Later, Another Near Future. So the future grows at different rates. Thank you.